Ringo Starr had always been known for his cheerful smile and steady presence. But when he turned 85, something in his usual joy seemed dimmed. During his birthday celebration, which he calls his annual peace and love moment, fans noticed something different. As he spoke about his friends and his life, his voice cracked, and tears began to fall. For the first time, he openly mourned his fellow Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison. Those who were watching could feel the deep sadness behind his words. Not long after that, he canceled his shows in Philadelphia and New York because of illness. Doctors told him to rest, but his emotional breakdown made fans wonder if something deeper was wrong with the last surviving Beatle. Richard Starkey, the man the world would come to know as Ringo Starr, was born on July 7, 1940, at 9 Madron Street in Liverpool. It was during one of the darkest times in British history. German bombs were falling on the city almost every night, shaking the streets and sending people running for shelter. His parents, Elsie and Richard Starkey Sr., tried to stay calm for their little boy, but fear was everywhere. His father worked as a baker, but as times grew tougher, he slowly started drifting away from the family. When Ringo was just 3 years old, his father left and never returned. His mother suddenly found herself alone, raising a child in a city torn by war. To survive, she worked during the day as a cleaner and spent her nights serving drinks as a barmaid. Life was hard, but she refused to give up. In 1944, when Ringo was only 4, the two had to move to a smaller and cheaper home because they couldn't afford rent anymore. They were poor, but they had each other. Then tragedy struck again. When Ringo was 6 years old, he became seriously ill. What started as stomach pain turned into a burst appendix. Doctors performed surgery, but things took a dangerous turn when he developed peritonitis, a life-threatening infection. He fell into a coma and remained in the hospital for nearly a year. His mother feared she might lose him. When he finally recovered and returned home in 1948, he was already 8 years old but had missed so much schooling that he couldn't even read or count properly. Still, Ringo didn't complain. He smiled through everything and simply kept going. Just when life seemed to be improving, fate tested him again. At 13, Ringo was still trying to catch up in school when a tuberculosis outbreak swept through Liverpool. He got sick once more and had to spend 2 long years in a special hospital for recovery. Those years were painfully lonely. No school, no friends, no noise except the echo of hospital sounds. One day, a nurse gave him a small cotton bobbin mallet and told him to tap it on a metal cabinet to pass the time. That single sound changed his life. It awakened something deep inside him, a love for rhythm. Later, a kind hospital worker gave him a record called Bedtime for Drums, and Ringo listened to it endlessly. The beats comforted him and gave him something that finally felt like his own. When he left the hospital, he returned to the tough Dingle neighborhood of Liverpool, one of the roughest parts of the city. It was full of gangs, fights, and crime. To survive, young Richard joined a local gang for protection. He often witnessed violence and was even attacked by rival boys. After one brutal beating, he began to question his place in the world. Small, shy, and unsure of himself, he turned to music as his escape. It was the one thing that made him feel free. In 1956, at 16, he found a job as an apprentice machinist in a factory. There, he met a co-worker named Roy Trafford, who loved a music style called skiffle, a mix of jazz, folk, and blues played on homemade instruments. Together with another worker named Eddie Miles, they began practicing in the factory basement and formed a small skiffle group. That Christmas, Ringo's stepfather, Harry Graves, bought him his first real drum kit, used but precious. 2 months later, Ringo joined the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group and played his first live show at the Cavern Club on July 31st, 1957. He worked long hours at the factory during the day and played music at night, never complaining about being tired. It was the only thing that made him feel alive. In 1959, another opportunity came when a local band called the Hurricanes asked him to join them. They were about to rename themselves Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and they wanted a proper drummer. Someone with real drums, not homemade ones. Ringo said yes. Around that time, he began calling himself Ringo Starr, inspired by the rings he wore and by his desire to sound like someone meant for the stage. When he got solo moments, the crowd would chant "Star Time," and his confidence began to grow. By 1960, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were among Liverpool's biggest bands, even more popular locally than a little-known group called the Beatles. That same year, both bands were invited to perform in Hamburg, Germany, a city known for its wild nightlife. Ringo and his band played long, exhausting sets in bars filled with loud, drunken crowds. Drugs, alcohol, and trouble were everywhere. It was chaos, but Ringo somehow kept his calm. During that time, he first played with John, Paul, and George when their drummer, Pete Best, couldn't make a session. It was October 1960, and they were backing singer Lou Walters on a song called Summertime. Nobody could have guessed that this small moment would change music history forever. Over the next 2 years, Ringo's path kept crossing with the Beatles. In early 1962, Pete Best began missing shows, and Ringo filled in for him again. George Harrison later said that the first time Ringo sat behind their drums, he knew they had found the missing piece. But Ringo was still tied to his contract with the Hurricanes and didn't think much of it. Then, on August 16, 1962, everything changed. Pete Best was suddenly fired, and 2 days later, Ringo officially joined the Beatles. The reaction was not what anyone expected. Fans were furious. Crowds chanted "Pete forever, Ringo never" at shows, and George Harrison was even attacked and left with a black eye. People threw things on stage, and Ringo received death threats. He began to doubt whether he had made the right decision. When they started recording with producer George Martin at Abbey Road Studios in September 1962, Ringo faced another blow. Martin wasn't impressed with his drumming and brought in another drummer, Andy White, to record instead. Ringo was asked to play tambourine. Humiliated, he thought his career was over. But he didn't give up. During their early tours, the other Beatles played practical jokes on him to test whether he could handle pressure. They hit his drums, changed schedules, and teased him relentlessly. Ringo stayed calm through it all, and slowly, he earned their respect. His drumming style was different. He was left-handed but played on a right-hand kit, creating a unique rhythm that became part of the Beatles' signature sound. He practiced constantly, driven by fear of being replaced, but that nervous energy made him better. In 1964, right before the Beatles' first world tour, Ringo collapsed with a high fever and was diagnosed with tonsillitis. The band had to decide whether to cancel or replace him. They brought in Jimmy Nicol as a temporary drummer. Lying in a hospital bed, Ringo feared that history would repeat itself, that he'd be replaced just like Pete Best. But a week later, he rejoined the band in Australia, still weak but determined. When the Beatles arrived in America for the first time in February 1964, thousands of fans were screaming before their plane even landed. Ringo's playful personality and friendly face made him a fan favorite. Yet fame came with danger. In San Francisco that June, hundreds of teenage girls surrounded him at the airport, and several fainted from excitement. Police had to form human barriers to protect him. Ringo smiled through it all, pretending he was fine, but the constant pressure was starting to wear him down. By 1965, while filming the movie Help, Into the Bahamas band's fame had turned into a burden. The shoot was filled with tension, bad weather, and disrespect from local officials. John Lennon drank heavily, and the others grew frustrated. Ringo, usually the peacemaker, tried to stay positive but could feel the cracks forming in their friendship. A year later, during their tour in Manila, a misunderstanding with the Philippine First Lady led to chaos. The Beatles were accused of insulting her, and suddenly their police protection disappeared. They were attacked at the airport, beaten, and robbed by government agents. Ringo was terrified and later said he never wanted to tour again. By 1967, during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Ringo's role in the group began to shrink. John, Paul, and George were experimenting with new sounds and drugs, and he often sat in the studio for hours with nothing to do. He learned to play chess just to pass the time. Even though his drumming on A Day in the Life became legendary later, at that moment, he felt invisible. George Harrison once said it didn't feel like a band anymore. It felt like Paul playing piano while Ringo kept time. Still, Ringo's steady rhythms were the glue that held their music together, even when no one noticed. Then came August 22nd, 1968. Something inside Ringo finally broke. During the recording of the White Album, he felt so unappreciated and unwanted that he walked out of the studio without telling anyone. He later said, "I felt like I didn't play well, and the other three were really happy without me." He left a note that simply said, "I quit." For 2 weeks, the Beatles continued recording without him, until John and Paul realized how much they needed him. When he finally returned, George had covered his drum kit with flowers as a peace offering. That small gesture reminded Ringo that he was loved, but the damage within the group was done. In the years that followed, the Beatles fell apart, and Ringo struggled to find his place in a world that suddenly felt empty. He built a solo career, acted in films, and became known for his kindness and humor. But behind the peace signs and smiles, there was always a hint of sadness, the weight of losing his closest friends, the fear of being forgotten, and the memories of a life that had started with hardship and never really stopped testing him. When he cried on his 85th birthday, fans saw not just an old musician breaking down, but a man who had survived poverty, illness, rejection, and global fame, only to outlive the people who once shared his dream. It wasn't just illness that made him cancel those concerts. It was grief, age, and the realization that time was finally catching up. Yet even through the tears, Ringo ended his speech the same way he has for decades, with his hands raised, giving the world his message of peace and love. Because after everything he's lived through, that's what he still believes in most. Ringo Starr had reached a breaking point inside Abbey Road Studios. Paul McCartney had just criticized his drumming on the song back in the USSR, and Ringo finally had enough. He told the others that he felt unloved, unwanted, and not good enough for the band anymore. John Lennon's reaction caught him off guard when he said, "I thought it was you three." Ringo realized they were all feeling disconnected from each other. Tired and heartbroken, he left everything behind and sailed away to Sardinia. Alone on a yacht, surrounded by the calm sea, he began writing Octopus's Garden. The song came from a simple place in his heart, a wish for peace, escape, and joy. Back at Abbey Road, the others soon regretted his absence. They sent messages begging him to return. When Ringo finally came back on September 4th, his drum kit was covered in flowers spelling out the words, "Welcome back, Ringo." For a moment, it felt like the love had returned. But by 1969, the tension inside the band had grown worse. Yoko Ono had broken what had once been an unspoken rule: no wives in the studio. After she and John were in a car crash, John brought a hospital bed right into Abbey Road so Yoko could rest there while watching them record. Ringo tried to keep the peace as arguments filled the room. It no longer felt like the joyful band they used to be. Yoko joked that heroin was their new form of exercise, but no one laughed. Ringo could see how much things had changed. Paul later said it felt like there was a fifth Beatle in the studio, and it wasn't another musician. It was the drug addiction that had taken hold of John. In September 1969, Ringo himself was rushed to the hospital with severe stomach pain. It turned out that the same kind of illness he had as a child had returned. The timing couldn't have been wise. It was right in the middle of recording the Abbey Road album. Paul, John, and George quietly wondered if they could finish the album without him. But deep down they knew it wouldn't be complete without their drummer. They were scared of losing their friend, and that fear made them realize how fragile their bond had become. A few weeks later, Ringo saw something that broke his heart even more. Inside the studio, John and Yoko were tied to a chair, sweating and trembling as they tried to quit heroin cold turkey. Ringo watched helplessly as John screamed for relief for 36 hours straight. When Ringo tried to comfort him, John lashed out, saying the band had driven him to this point. That night, John wrote the song Cold Turkey. A few days later, he was using again. Ringo could see his friend slipping away, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. By 1970, the end of the Beatles was near. Ringo was sent to Paul's house to ask him to delay his solo album so that the band's Let It Be release wouldn't be overshadowed. Instead of agreeing, Paul exploded. He yelled, pointed his finger in Ringo's face, and shouted, "I'll finish you now." Ringo quietly put on his coat and left. It was the only time their friendship had ever turned violent. Later, Ringo wrote a song called Early 1970, gently teasing Paul's new life on his farm and showing how far apart they had all grown. Then came the official end. On April 10, 1970, Paul publicly announced that the Beatles were over. Ringo didn't hear it from his bandmates. He found out through the news. The shock hit him hard. He fell into depression, spending long hours sitting silently in his garden, staring at the sky and wondering who he was now that the music had stopped. The man who had once been terrified of being replaced now found himself in a silence that no drumbeat could fix. Later that same year, Paul sued the others to dissolve their partnership. Ringo, to everyone's surprise, took Paul's side. John and George were furious. They thought their issues with Paul had been settled, but Ringo believed ending the legal ties was the only way to move forward. The lawsuit made it clear that their brotherhood had truly shattered. Despite everything, Ringo kept trying to heal through music. In April 1971, he released Early 1970 as the B-side to It Don't Come Easy. The lyrics mentioned each of his old friends. George might join if he's around, John might play if he's nearby, but Paul won't even talk to him. The song quietly revealed Ringo's pain, showing how much he still cared even though they had drifted apart. Money troubles soon followed. Their manager, Alan Klein, had kept the band's royalties locked up for years, leaving them with little control over their own income. By mid-1971, Paul was paying his new band out of his own pocket, while Ringo struggled to release his solo projects. His album Sentimental Journey came out around the same time as Paul's solo debut, but it was overshadowed completely. Even though it sold 500,000 copies in 2 weeks, it never reached the success he had hoped for. He realized then that no matter how much love he poured into his work, his past with the Beatles would always follow him like a shadow. But there were still moments of light. On August 1, 1971, George organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major benefit concerts in history. John agreed to join until he found out Yoko wasn't invited to perform, and he walked out. Paul refused to attend. Only Ringo showed up, standing proudly beside George and playing for thousands of fans. He smiled on stage, hiding the pain behind his eyes. The cheers were loud, but to him, it felt more like a farewell than a reunion. By 1973, Ringo finally had a huge solo hit. His song Photograph, co-written with George Harrison, became #1 in the US, Canada, and Australia. It sold over 1 million copies and gave him his biggest solo moment. After years of heartbreak, he finally stood in the spotlight by himself, and the world applauded. Years passed, and Ringo found ways to keep going. In 1989, he formed the All-Star Band and returned to the stage after more than 2 decades away from touring. The early shows were rough, and critics laughed at the idea of him leading a band. But Ringo didn't care. He played Beatles songs, his own hits, and even let his bandmates perform theirs. Fans cried with joy seeing him behind the drums again. The All-Star Band would go on to tour for over 30 years, proving his love for music had never faded. In 1998, Ringo released the album Vertical Man, which featured contributions from George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ozzy Osbourne, and Tom Petty. Despite the big names, Ringo struggled to pay for the studio. When a secretary came by to collect rent, he asked her to play cello on a track, and she agreed. When George sent over his guitar parts for the album, Ringo burst into tears, whispering, "You've got me crying, you bugger." The bond between them, though quieter now, was still there. His acting career had its ups and downs. In 1969, Ringo starred in The Magic Christian alongside Peter Sellers. It was meant to be a funny film, but the shocking and strange scenes made him uncomfortable, especially those involving nudity. Critics hated it and called it tasteless. Ringo later admitted he had been embarrassed and learned to be more careful about his film choices. Years later, in 1981, he starred in the comedy Caveman. While filming, he broke his arm badly, forcing him to rest. But that injury brought him closer to his co-star, Barbara Bach. They fell in love and were married soon after the film ended. The movie wasn't a big hit, but it led to one of Hollywood's longest-lasting marriages. During the 1970s, Ringo also tried his hand at furniture design, starting a company with designer Robin Cruikshank. They created expensive custom furniture and even made tables with Rolls-Royce grills built into them. But the market wasn't interested, and by the mid-1980s, the business collapsed, costing Ringo a fortune. He learned that creativity didn't always mean success in business. In the 1980s, children loved hearing Ringo's calm voice as the narrator and Mr. Conductor on Thomas the Tank Engine. He became part of childhood memories for millions. But in 1989, a contract dispute led to him being replaced by American comedian George Carlin. Fans were devastated. Carlin joked that he had become the anti-Pete Best, referring to how Ringo once replaced the Beatles' first drummer. Though Carlin did fine, many fans said the show never felt the same without Ringo's warmth. Ringo's personal life, however, was often painful. His first marriage to Maureen Cox had been full of problems. By 1970, it was falling apart. Ringo drank too much, cheated often, and was rarely home. The final blow came when George Harrison confessed that he had fallen in love with Maureen. One night, she even found George in her bed. When Ringo found out, he didn't yell or fight. He just said, "Better you than someone we don't know." Their marriage officially ended in 1975, with Ringo paying Maureen a large settlement and giving her custody of their children. In the late 1970s, Ringo's drinking and drug use got worse. He overdosed in 1978 and was rushed to the hospital. He admitted later that he sometimes drank 16 bottles of wine in one day and barely ate because of cocaine. His home became chaotic. His stepdaughter, Francesca, described it as a drug den where he and Barbara hid away from the world. Ringo said he had pictures of himself performing on stage but couldn't remember any of it. The breaking point came in 1988 when Ringo woke up one day to find his home destroyed. His staff thought it had been robbed, but it was him. He had done it while drunk. Barbara was badly bruised and nearly unconscious. That horrifying moment pushed them both into rehab in Arizona. It saved their lives. Ringo later admitted that he had known he had a drinking problem for years but didn't know how to stop. Rehab gave him another chance, and from that point on, he committed to sobriety. In the decades that followed, Ringo rebuilt his life and reputation. But even then, challenges kept coming. In 2024, at the age of 84, he suddenly fell ill just before a concert in Philadelphia. Doctors ordered him to rest, forcing him to cancel that show and another one at Radio City Music Hall in New York. Fans were deeply concerned. He had already played most of his tour, and though he insisted he still felt strong and exercised daily, everyone knew time was catching up. Then came his 85th birthday in 2025. What should have been a happy celebration became an emotional moment for fans around the world. Beverly Hills declared it Ringo Starr Day. But what people remembered most was his tearful speech during the annual Peace and Love moment. For the first time, Ringo openly mourned John Lennon and George Harrison. The tradition that started with a small crowd in Chicago in 2008 had now spread to 30 countries, and even NASA joined by beaming his message to the moon and back. It was more than a birthday. It was a tribute to his lost brothers. Still, Ringo refused to slow down. He announced that he had finished 2 new country albums, one produced by T-Bone Burnett, and planned to release them in 2026. When reporters asked if he was finally retiring, he laughed and said his kids were tired of hearing that question. He said that if anyone called with a gig offer, he'd still be ready to go. But 2025 also brought fresh controversy. His charity, the Lotus Foundation, had raised millions through his art shows, including a recent exhibit in Las Vegas featuring paintings made with a spinning Rolls-Royce engine. Every dollar went to causes like cancer research and addiction recovery. Then came reports from the Pandora Papers revealing Ringo had several offshore trusts in Panama and the Bahamas that handled his royalties. There was no proof of any wrongdoing, but the headlines caused speculation. Ringo chose not to respond. He simply let his actions and generosity speak for themselves. Through every rise and fall, one thing has never changed: Ringo Starr's heart. He has seen war, poverty, fame, addiction, and loss, yet still preaches peace and love to the world. Even as the last surviving Beatle, he carries the legacy with humility, humor, and grace, proving that no matter how dark life becomes, the beat must always go on.